3.5 million documents, 2,000 videos, 180,000 images, released by the United States Department of Justice. All of it about one man. On the morning those files were released, some of the most famous people in the world went very quiet. Not because they had been mentioned, because they had to find out if they were. You already know names are coming. Every outlet in the world has published a list. But a list tells you nothing. A list does not tell you why. Why a man convicted of sex crimes against children continued to receive private jets, penthouse dinners, and birthday letters from some of the most credentialed people on earth. After the conviction, that is the question nobody is asking. Not who was connected to Jeffrey Epstein, but why the most powerful people in the world kept returning to a man they claim they barely knew. The answer is not in the names. It is in the machine that made the names irrelevant to protect. To understand what the files revealed, you need to go back. Not to 2008 when Epstein was convicted. Not to 2019 when he was arrested again. Further, to 1953. That year, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a classified program called MKUltra. Its methods included drugging, psychological manipulation, and the deliberate use of sex to compromise targets. It was not a theory. It was policy. For 2 decades, that program ran without public knowledge. Then, in 1975, the United States Senate convened what became known as the Church Committee. What it found was entered into the official congressional record. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had been running honeypot operations, using manufactured sexual encounters to blackmail political targets, for 30 years. Senators, civil rights leaders, journalists. The mechanism had a name. The government had been using it for a generation. In 1976, a young teacher at the Dalton School in Manhattan was quietly removed from his post. Students had noticed something wrong. The administration had noticed something wrong. The response was not accountability. It was a phone call to a better school. That teacher's name was Jeffrey Epstein, and the institution that should have stopped him instead handed him to the next one. What the Senate documented in 1975 was a playbook. Epstein did not write it. He licensed it. He ran it for decades in Palm Beach, on a private island, in townhouses on the Upper East Side. And he ran it without consequence because the people who could have stopped him had already been to the party. The question is not whether a system like this could exist. The Senate confirmed it existed in 1975. The question is what it looked like 40 years later. Jeffrey Epstein had no verifiable source of income, no degree, no credentials, no documented investment track record that any regulator or journalist has ever been able to locate. In 1991, Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of Victoria's Secret, one of the most powerful retail executives in America, gave Epstein power of attorney over his entire fortune. Not a portion of it, all of it.
$500 million of money came from Les Wexner, who's a wealthy guy who owns or owned, I don't know what he's doing now, Victoria's Secret, big donator to the state of Israel. And $500 million was transferred to Epstein along with power of attorney to use it and invest it in the ways he saw fit.
Wexner handed a con man with no credentials control over billions of dollars. And with that transfer, Epstein didn't just become wealthy. He became legitimate. That legitimacy was the product. Every powerful person who came after, every senator, every scientist, every celebrity was not drawn to Epstein's money. They were drawn to what his money signaled he already was. In 2007, Palm Beach police handed the FBI a case. Federal prosecutors built a 32-count indictment. 32 counts. Named victims. Signed by law enforcement. A case prosecutors believed that would put Jeffrey Epstein in prison for the rest of his life. What happened next is in the federal record. In 2008, the United States Department of Justice signed a non-prosecution agreement with Jeffrey Epstein's legal team. 32 counts became 2. He served 13 months, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. outside his cell on work release. What that document means, in plain terms, is that federal prosecutors had the evidence, named the victims, and chose not to use it. Not because the case was weak, because the defendant was well-connected enough that the case was quietly renegotiated in private. That is not an allegation. That is the signed agreement. After 2008, Jeffrey Epstein was a registered sex offender. His network did not collapse. It expanded. In 2003, before his arrest, his closest associates compiled a 238-page birthday book. Letters, photographs, personal notes. The investigators who later reviewed it described it in one sentence. It was a big inside joke, and everyone was in on it, other than the victims. That book was assembled by people who knew, who laughed about it, who signed their names. After his conviction, those same circles did not distance themselves. They kept the dinners, kept the correspondence, kept the flights. 3.2 million documents confirm it. 2,000 videos, 180,000 images. The files are not a revelation about one man's crimes. They are a revelation about how many people decided those crimes were acceptable proximity. The island had a name, Little St. James, 72 acres in the United States Virgin Islands. It was not a retreat. It was infrastructure. The gratification was real. The intellectuals who flew there discussed physics. The politicians who visited believed they were networking. The access felt freely given. That was the design. Because when gratification is real, documentation becomes leverage. And leverage over senators, over scientists, over the people who write laws and fund institutions, is worth more than any investment portfolio. Epstein was not a predator who happened to have powerful friends. He was a professional fixer, operating in the space between governments and private power, supplying what neither could formally request. Congressman Thomas Massie co-authored the Epstein Files Transparency Act. He compelled the Department of Justice to release what it had. When asked if the files contained criminal material, he said one word: absolutely. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whose names are attached to it. Some of those names will surprise you. Most of them shouldn't. Here is the question people keep asking. How did Epstein fool the world? That is the wrong question. The right question is this: what does it mean that the world was designed to be fooled? Because a system that requires active deception is fragile, can be exposed, can be dismantled. But a system that requires nothing from you, except the assumption that powerful people are roughly who they appear to be, that system runs itself. We did not fail to see it. We were never meant to. Before any of this became public, people were warned. They were told an island existed, that powerful men were being filmed, that the footage was leverage, and they called it a conspiracy theory. Not because the evidence was weak, because the claim was uncomfortable enough that dismissal felt like reason. That reflex, the trained rejection of claims too disturbing to be credible, is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of the system, a system that generates its own immunity. Because if the truth sounds like a conspiracy theory, it will be treated like one. And it was, for 20 years. In 1956, sociologist Irving Goffman published a study of how human beings present themselves in public life. His argument was precise. Every person maintains two versions of themselves. The front stage, the public performance. Curated, controlled, the version the world is invited to see. And the backstage, where the performance is suspended. Epstein's network was a backstage. Every name in those files had a front stage the world trusted, the philanthropist, the scientist, the entertainer, the filmmaker, and a backstage Epstein had access to. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of a person that the public persona cannot afford to acknowledge. The disowned twin every performance carries just offstage. We watched their films. We read their books. We attended their shows. That trust was not naivety. That trust was the product. We trusted the front stage because the backstage was never meant to be seen. That is not our failure. That is the design. In 1928, a man named Edward Bernays published a book called Propaganda. His argument was not about force. It was about desire. The most effective control, Bernays wrote, does not feel like control. It engineers environments where compliance feels like personal fulfillment, where the person being managed believes they are acting freely because the desire is real. Epstein understood this completely. The island was not a trap. It was an invitation. Scientists discussed physics. Intellectuals argued theory. Politicians felt they were among equals. The gratification was genuine. That was the point. Because when gratification is genuine, the documentation it enables is uncontestable. The men who flew there did not feel like victims of a system. They felt like guests at a party. Bernays wrote that distinction in 1928. Epstein operationalized it in 2003. In 1963, philosopher Hannah Arendt covered the trial of a Nazi administrator named Adolf Eichmann. What she found disturbed her more than she expected. Eichmann was not a monster. He was a functionary, an intelligent, professional man who had simply learned to compartmentalize his role, to execute his piece of the system without identifying himself as responsible for what the system did. Arendt called it the banality of evil. Evil, she argued, does not require monsters. It requires administrators. In 2003, Jeffrey Epstein's associates compiled his 50th birthday book. 238 pages. Letters, photographs, personal notes. The New York Times later described it in one sentence. It was a big inside joke, and everyone was in on it, other than the victims. Not monsters, administrators. Arendt wrote about them in 1963. They were still signing birthday cards in Palm Beach in 2003. Pierre Bourdieu spent his career mapping how power accumulates. His finding, access precedes money. Relationships precede credentials. Epstein had no credentials. He had access. And access, Bourdieu documented, converts into everything else. In 1956, sociologist C. Wright Mills published The Power Elite, the first formal map of how military, political, and corporate leadership in America forms an interlocking class whose collective interests supersede accountability to anyone outside it. Every name in the Epstein files is a node in that map. This is not new. The only thing new is the documentation. In a moment, we are going to look at who was specifically inside this system, not the famous names you already know, the ones that tell you something you were not supposed to find out. One thing the Epstein files make clear is that information has always been the real currency. What you know, and what others know about you determines your position in any system. Now, the names. The ones the files show weren't just photographs at a party. The first name is not a politician, not a senator, not a billionaire, a magician. David Copperfield, one of the most recognized entertainers in the world, left 16 separate voicemails for Jeffrey Epstein between 2004 and 2005. When asked about them, his legal team said they were routine ticket requests. The FBI said something different. In an official law enforcement memo entered into the Epstein files, agents wrote that Copperfield and Epstein had a, and this is the document's language, very close relationship. The same investigation examined whether the two men shared what the memo called a predilection for minors, whether they referred victims to each other. That is not a rumor. That is a federal law enforcement document. In the files, Copperfield is referred to directly as a friend of Jeff. He has denied wrongdoing. The document has not changed. Noam Chomsky is the most cited academic in modern history. He built a career documenting how power conceals itself. His name appears in Jeffrey Epstein's personal calendar, entered into evidence in the DOJ file release. When the Wall Street Journal contacted him about the relationship, Chomsky replied by email. His first sentence, "It is none of your business or anyone's." That is a quote from the on-record exchange. But Chomsky himself had already gone further. In a published letter of support, he described Epstein as, his words, a highly valued friend and regular source of intellectual exchange and stimulation. There is also a photograph, Chomsky and Epstein, on Epstein's private jet, destination unknown. The man who spent decades writing about the architecture of manufactured consent was documented inside the architecture of manufactured consent. That is not irony. That is the Goffman thesis made specific. Woody Allen met with Epstein after the 2008 conviction, after he was a registered sex offender, after the plea deal. In September 2025, Allen told the New York Times he found those dinners, his word, fascinating. He described Epstein as charming and personable. Hundreds of pages of text exchanges between the two men are in the files. In one, Epstein wrote to Allen's wife, "The crowd needs a witch to burn. Have to be careful." Epstein also claimed credit for arranging a White House tour for Allen and his family in 2015, after the conviction, after the registration. Allen has said he found Epstein interesting as a character study. The files suggest Epstein found Allen useful for something more specific. Stephen Hawking attended a conference at Epstein's compound in the United States Virgin Islands. He is also named in Virginia Giuffre's sworn legal testimony. In 2015, a private email between Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, now in the DOJ file release, shows Epstein discussing a cash reward to disprove Giuffre's claims. Hawking died in 2018. Giuffre died in 2024. There will be no trial. There will be no clarification. Every name in these files existed inside a system. Virginia Giuffre was 14 years old when she entered it. She spent years in court, giving testimony, being disbelieved, watching settlements, watching powerful men issue statements. She fought for these files to be released. She did not live to see the reckoning she was promised. Congressman Thomas Massie, who co-authored the legislation that forced the files into public record, said this on the congressional record: "This spans 4 presidents, part of a 2-decade-long cover-up. Some of the richest people on the planet have the lowest moral standards on the planet. That is the document. That is the system. Those are the names. The files exist. Every document, every email chain, every calendar entry. The evidence was compiled by the same institutions that declined to use it. 32 counts, 13 months. That is not a failure of the system. That is the system working as designed for the people it was designed to protect." Congressman Massie said this on the record. If you have learned all of this and you are still dispassionate or want to move on or don't care, it means you are not willing to take up for the weakest people in our society. We are not asking you to fix it. We are only asking you to see it, because the system has always depended on the same thing, that you won't. The files didn't reveal a monster living among respectable people. They revealed that respectability was the monster's address.